Chapter 14. Anne felt a little better in the morning, though not completely rested. She rose and dressed, pleased to find that Shannon, or someone, had put all of the clothes she had brought with her in the wardrobe. Unbraiding and brushing out her hair, she put it up in her usual knot and headed into the kitchen. She set a kettle on the boil for tea and set about making herself porridge for breakfast. She ate in comfortable silence and set her dishes in the sink with a little water in them, intending to wash them when she got back, and headed out into the garden. She found a small potting shed on the bedroom side of the house and a new pair of gardening gloves. She went down to investigate the strange yellow rose that had caught her attention the day before. It looked decidedly unhealthy. She went back to the shed and looked through what was available. There was bone meal and several other types of plant feed and flower boosters. She decided to start with the bone meal and water. She fertilized it and took a pair of pruning shears to the dead branch tips, cutting with expert care. It was a particularly prickly rose with a lot of little thorns all along the stems. It had several really long, wicked thorns that were purplish red and thicker and longer than any rose she had ever seen. She kept catching her gloves and sleeves on them. Humming softly to herself, she worked, doing what she could for it. When all that was left was to wait and see, she took off a glove and cupped one of the yellow blooms. It filled her hand as she ran her thumb over the petals. She frowned to find it limp and soft instead of the firm velvet of the other roses in the garden. "'Tis at your location, I wonder," she mused aloud, "or something you need. The other roses are thriving down wall, but here you are, all by your lone." She felt a sudden awareness of someone else near and looked towards the house. She moved her hand from the rose and reached out to the wall, cutting herself on a thorn in the process. She gave a tiny gasp, but paid it no other mind, set her hand on the stone. Suddenly, she could see Skye standing at the gate, trying to figure out whether to knock on the post or to go up to the door and knock. She smiled. Let him in, she thought, and laughed as he jumped back when the gate opened on its own for him. Skye cautiously crossed the threshold into the front garden, turned to watch the gate swing ominously closed behind him as he backed down the path. He turned towards the front door and saw her standing at the corner of the house, watching him. It was odd seeing her look at him and standing there without her stick, like a sighted woman but for the cloud-filled eyes. There was a faint darkening under those clouds, but otherwise she looked none the worse. You seem recovered," he stammered. "Morning, Commander. What brings you by?" she asked, drawing on her other glove and bending to a patch of ground to begin marking out new beds. Just checking up on you for last night. There were others worried, and we're neighbours after all." He watched the concise movements she made with a small clawed tool, grabbing chunks of earth and deftly turning them. "Where'd a fine lady like yourself learn that?" She gave a humph as she worked. "One, I'm no lady and never were. My father was a laird's groundskeeper on lands our family owned for 700 years before the Sassenach came," she spat. "I worked for my bread from the day I was old enough to hold a trowel. Oh, I learned my letters, and that's what saved me in the end. And my Irish, secretly at my grandfather's knee." She sank back on her heels, wiped the little bit of sweat from her brow with the back of her glove, and looked over the freshly turned black earth. She looked up at him. "I've not remembered so much at once before." "Thank you, Commander. Apparently I need to get my Irish up to remember where it comes from." "No worries, lass. Was there somewhat else I can help you with?" Skye felt uncomfortable under the scrutiny. He took a breath, stood straighter. "We need to talk, Banan Kiobran." She set her tool down. "I have not heard that title in—" She shook her head. "Too long," he breathed in agreement. She rose, pulling off her gloves. "Well, I suppose I should invite you in and put on tea." He followed her into the house, watched her set her tool and gloves on the bench by the door, and slip off the simple, low brogue she had worn outside. "You'll have to pardon my bare feet. The house is particular, I've learned." She got a warm, happy feeling from the polished wood beneath her toes at the statement, and smiled. She took note that there were 2 chairs by the small fire now, and she gestured for Skye to take one of them. She crossed to the kitchen to fill the kettle, only to find that her breakfast dishes were gone. She ran her fingers along the edge of the cupboard tenderly, thinking even as she turned the stove on, "Should I put out honey and milk, or is this all you?" She got the distinct feeling that she should, though leaving a little tea in the pot once in a while would also be welcomed. That, and she might want to set out the honey and milk at the bottom of the garden. I have pixies, do I? She mused out loud, surprised. Sky looked up. I'm sorry? Nothing, she smiled, going to the pantry for the tea. Just musing to myself. It seems I have pixies in the garden. He frowned. That's a bad thing? She shook her head. No, not if I keep them happy. And that should be easy. I'll need to learn the path through the wood from the gate down garden, though. Easier than walking around the longhouse every time. You mean my meat hall? She nodded. Aye. He waited until she brought the tea tray to the small coffee table before he attempted to make himself say what he needed to. He watched her frown at the table that she did not remember being there this morning. Then she moved on as if it were no matter at all, began to serve the tea. He smiled to see little shortbread biscuits on the tray and helped himself to one. They were as crumbly and buttery as he remembered them being. She sat back in her chair, cup and saucer in hand, and sipped quietly, waiting for him to say what he came to. It was important to him, or he would not have used that name. So she waited him out. It was apparently a difficult thing for him to express. After a few swallows from the delicate cup and the whole of the first biscuit, he made himself start. I have concerns. He held up his hand to ward off any protest, having caught a hint of something around her eyes. I ken you think it's none of mine, and I know you ken how I feel about what I've been charged to. We'll just have to disagree on that point. She sipped silently, watching him. That had been more diplomatic than she had expected from him. But, look, I've been given charge of folks' safety afore, and discharged my duties without a hitch, emotionally speaking, even when I had to guard through combat. I had one ticket into his bat head to wander off and get himself near throttled for his trouble. And neither did I react in my gut the way I reacted last night to your scream. She sat up a little straighter, confused. Was he declaring himself? She didn't know how she felt about that. She knew she took comfort from his presence, but that was a different thing, wasn't it? He thought she was looking at him, and it disturbed him just a little that he couldn't be sure or really read those cloudy orbs. I'll give a damn what happens to you, lass. If I dinna, I'd be on guard 24/7 and damn your complaints to the contrary. That I've stepped back and let you have a life of your own tells me a lot about how I feel. If you can accept my occasional overprotectiveness... Only occasional? She asked softly. He gave a self-depreciating laugh. I deserve that. But if you can accept it, I'll try to stay mostly out of your way. So you're just wanting to make sure I stay safe? He nodded, taking another biscuit. And so long as I accept occasional interference, you'll not be moving in and reordering my life. He winced. When you put it like that. She set her cup aside on the table by her chair and regarded him. He now knew firsthand how she had managed 3 of the gentry's children for over a century. It will all depend on whether you'll accept that there will be times when I tell you to go boil your head and mind your own. He started, biscuit in his mouth, as what she had said, and how she'd said it, sank in. He hurriedly swallowed, began to say one thing, then changed his mind. Just don't hit me with that sick. 'Tis an ugly mug I ha on it, but I'm fond of my head, he complained, rubbing it. She laughed. Very well, I shan't hit you in the head. That didn't bode well, but as she reached under the table to pull out her lacework, he decided to let it go. He watched her hook flying through the thread with fascination a moment before he remembered there was a reason he had brought up the subject. As I said earlier, I have some concerns. The horse is fine, and I'm glad 'tis between Liberty and myself, letting her sister her across the way. But the bard worries me. He has a reputation, you see. He couldn't tell if her eyes were on her crochet or on him. That, Commander, is one of those times, she warned. He bristled. At least hear me out, woman. He set the cup down lest he break it. You'll make your own mind on't, but I'll be damned you don't know what you risk. She continued to crochet, saying nothing, and he went on. I know how you treasure your virtue and integrity. He's well known for bedding lasses around here, breaking hearts as he clings to none of 'em long. They say he walked away from his own betrothed for that northern bit. He bit off the word that came to his mouth, conscious of the governess's sensibilities. For her. Says somewhat that he left Ian the Red Queen. I just don't want to see you hurt, or your reputation tarnished by your association. So don't go off alone with him or entertain him alone here. I understand. I have some sense, Commander. We weren't alone last night, and I made sure we were near enough to others for propriety afore... Well, she demurred. My name's Skye, he protested. I'm not the commander no more. Very well then, Skye, she said, made a gesture with her eyebrows that could very well have been a shrug. He stood, not trusting his frustration. That man's got to have his hands full with you. Thank you for the tea and your time, he growled, turning and letting himself out. He stormed down the walk and opened the gate, jumped again when it slammed behind him faster than he could get out of the way. Inside, Anne set aside her lace and sighed, staring into the fireplace. What am I getting myself into? Liberty's presence at the gate made her jump. She rose as Liberty was coming down the path and met her at the door. Hello, dear, she smiled, trying to put a less beleaguered look on her face. Am I late? Liberty laughed. No, love, that's tomorrow. I thought I'd come by today and either visit or invite you over. Thought we could talk. She nodded, stepped back from the door. Come in. I've a whole pot of tea and a plate of shortbread. She led the way into the house, intending to go to the kitchen for a clean cup, when she noticed that there was one, turned neatly upside down on the saucer next to the plate. Skye's cup was nowhere to be seen. She smiled and offered Liberty the other chair. So, Liberty began as she took her seat and let Anne pour her a cup. What'd you do to put poor Skye in such a state? Anne chuckled. Accepted his terms and issued a challenge, I think. Did that lummox offer you an ultimatum? She added a bit of honey to her tea, stirring. No, well, maybe. He said he'd stay mostly out of my life so long as I accepted the occasional button in. I told him fine, so long as he accepted I'd occasionally tell him to stuff it. She huffed. I swear he sounded like my brother. One of 'em. She frowned. I'm pretty sure I had more than one. And that they were as insufferable as all brothers are. Liberty smiled as she chose a biscuit. Unfortunately, I never had that problem. Anne daintily crossed her ankles as she picked up her crochet from the table, and Liberty took note of their nakedness. She gave a mock gasp, hiding her smile behind her hand. Anne, I'm surprised at you, entertaining a man in your bare feet. She raised an eyebrow at that. He doesn't count as company, she said curtly. He's going to act like a brother, he'll have to concede to being treated like one. She looked down at her crochet while Liberty dissolved into laughter, frowned to note that there were at least 2 rows more on the doily than she had put there. She sighed and addressed the house at large. Well, I'm not ungrateful for the thought. I'd prefer you left my busy work alone. I need something to do with my hands at night before bed, and as you won't let me do dishes. Through her feet she got the impression that the message had been received, and not unkindly. Liberty sat back, watching the odd exclamation. House elves? Aye, apparently. How'd you like the shortbread? Liberty smiled. I always like Martha's shortbread. Anne stopped. You mean my pantry is the Manors? Liberty nodded. And you didn't tell me? Danny made the arrangements. Martha knows. So 'tis likely your brownie is one of the families, looking to set up their own housekeeping. Lucky that. So, she grinned, do you have an idea what you're wanting to be for the winter mask? Anne put down her discomfort at finding out she was tapping the Manor's pantry, and concentrated on trying to count her stitches, finding out where the brownie had left her. Once she figured that out, she began working. I have an idea, but I don't know. Liberty sipped her tea. Tell me anyway. You said you want to keep Henry guessing, so he doesn't know who you are. That's the idea, she smirked. Anne tipped her head, concentrating on her stitches so she wouldn't have to look at her friend. What if there were a queen present? Or someone who could very well be one? Liberty's eyes lit up. What had you in mind? Well, all the ladies are going to be vaguely magic. I won't have to worry about bumping into them, and roulette solved the object issue. I might be able to... But I'd be a bad choice. She shook her head, cutting herself off. Nah, I think you're perfect. Providing you're okay fending Henry off. He can be pretty handsy. Anne gave a small shake of her head. What I'm thinking of, he won't make so bold. Either way, it'll distract him, wondering if you dared. She tilted her head, eyeing Anne carefully, her doll's eyes trying to read the governess's expression. What are you? Anne shook her head. If I'm going to do it, I need it all to be a surprise. I'm not sure yet if I can manage it. I'll let you know if it falls through. All right, she drawled, not sure about this, but willing to trust. Will you need the charm from the witch? I'll let you know. but I don't think I will. What are you going as?" Liberty fairly crowed. "That is the best part. Roulette and I are going as Jack and Jill. I'm Jack. Henry'll never find me. Of course, likely neither will da." Anne smiled at her deviousness and poured herself a second cup of tea from the still steaming pot, sitting back to enjoy the company. Later that night, before she lay down to bed, she wrote a letter to the children. It asked after their health and progress, detailed some of her life here so far. She gave details of the creatures they'd fought off at the Tallows, in hopes there might be something familiar about them or their method, or some tidbit that might be of use to the king. She asked the princess if there were any subjects she would like books on. Only then did she ask for a chance to speak with them on a small matter, a personal favor. She set the letter and the lace gloves she had made in the carved box and closed the lid. When Anne woke the next morning, she did not feel like she had slept much. There had been dreams, she knew, but she couldn't remember them, and felt actually grateful for that. She had the impression they had been horrid. She rose, found she had sweated in the night, and stumbled to the kitchen to set the kettle. She was pleased to find a large, claw-footed tub steaming in front of the fireplace. There were towels warming on the hearth, and the curtains were drawn and dark. With a small exclamation of joy and relief, she drifted over, slipping out of her gown and into the hot, fragrant water. There was a small table next to the tub at her elbow, with a sponge and a bar of soap that smelled of roses and a hint of citrus. Actual roses, not the sickly sweet perfume they called rose in this modern day. She washed, using the soap on her hair as well, then lay back and soaked, determined not to get out until the water was cold. The moment she thought that, she realized it never would, unless she wanted it to. She decided she would soak a good 15 minutes before getting out, and sensed an agreement from the house. She sank beneath the water, holding her breath as she had since she was young, and suddenly the water seemed endlessly deep and eternally cold, and she was boiling hot. She flailed in a panic, and just as suddenly she was lying in an empty tub, shivering, with reassuring thoughts washing over her from the house. She crawled out of the tub, which was apologizing profusely, grabbed the towel and wrapped it around herself. She stood, fled back into the bedroom, assuring the house it wasn't its fault. In the room, her bed was made, the linens changed, and an appropriate dress was laid out for her. She dressed hurriedly, remembering she was supposed to meet Liberty for lunch after Mass. She heard something in the distance and stopped tucking herself in to listen. The sound grew louder, and she could hear the church bells ringing. She finished getting dressed, turned to her dressing table for her brush, and saw the box. Immediately she forgot the brush and opened it. Inside was a letter on pristine white parchment, sealed with a roaring lion's head in gold wax. She sat to read the flowing script of Irish words. His handwriting had matured greatly, the words drawn bold and firm. "Greetings, favoured teacher. Your letter finds us well and thriving. Our brother says he misses you, but hopes you are happy. Teddy sends his greetings as well. Though our brother has aged as he should, Teddy still stands guard while he does what he does. Eagle requests books on this thing called electricity. She says it is like lightning but harnessed. We have begun dealing with elementals of this type from the swamplands, and she believes understanding of this principle will help us fight them. As for your request, I intend to go on a hunt this evening. Meet me at my pavilion near the gate at dusk. I ride at moonrise. The Lion Prince." Anne closed the letter and put it in a drawer, nervous now that she was so close to having to ask for what she wanted. She still wasn't sure what exactly it was she wanted. She brushed out her hair and pinned it up hastily. She found her boots waiting for her on the bench by the door, along with a medium-sized black leather handbag. She peeked inside and smiled to discover her crochet. She slipped into her boots and laced them up, grabbing the bag and Capine on her way out the door. Liberty had decided they were going out for lunch and piled on into her car, driving them out of the rest. "What's in the bag?" she asked as they drove slowly through the ambling streets towards the wall. "I've never seen you carry a handbag. My brownie seems to think I'll need my crochet today. Though it does give me an idea. I know I should have some money set by. Miss Jones said something about an account, but I have no idea how much is there or how to access it. I would like to pick up some more thread and some books." "We can do that. You want a bookstore or the library?" Anne gave a half laugh. "I don't think these books will ever be returned, so I'd best buy them. I might need your help picking them out. What I'll be getting can't be in Braille." All right, I'm game. The two of them spent a pleasant Sunday afternoon out and about. They had lunch in a quaint little cafe, eating outdoors where the September wind played endearing melodies through the dying leaves. At the craft store, Anne bought several skeins of yarn that, while not wool, were certainly soft and warm, and Liberty helped her to pick out colors. She also got a second set of hooks in a neat leather case and a large spool of white crochet thread. At the bookstore, Liberty helped her find several good volumes on electricity and lightning without ever asking what they were for. It did not seem long before they were headed back to the rest for Sunday dinner at the Manor. Martha had made corned beef as promised, and it was every bit the savory concoction she remembered. It was a pleasant dinner, with only one new face and less a few others, but she had come to expect that at the Manor. The newly rescued came and went. As it got closer to evening, she began to feel more nervous, worried she would be too late. Finally, Shannon announced that the game was starting shortly, and if folk wanted, they could take dessert in the living room. This was greeted with enthusiasm and caused Ian to pull the woman in for a kiss on the cheek. "You're too good to me, Shannon, my love," he crowed. She gave him a swat and told him to go stuff himself and watch his confounded ball game. Anne lingered back, getting up slower than the others, calling Capine to her. She politely declined the caramel apple bake that Martha was doling out for the pack in front of the telly. "Too rich for me tonight. I have to go home tomorrow. I'd like an early night." It wasn't a lie. She wanted an early night, as she was tired beyond belief. She just wasn't going to get it. Martha sighed, accepting the excuse. "Well, if you want any for breakfast, I'll set some in the back pantry for you. Don't be a stranger now you have a home of your own." Anne bent to press a kiss to her doughy cheek and headed for the back door. She adjusted her shawl on her shoulders and took her bag tightly in hand, told Capine to lead her home past the Rath. She hadn't gone more than a few yards past the veranda when Skye caught up with her. She tightened her jaw, forced herself to put on a pleasant smile. "I've Capine with me, Skye. I can find my way home fine. You needn't miss the ball game for my sake." He dismissed the notion. "They say we were going to watch a football game. What they're watching aren't football, more like carry ball. I'm going home anyway." She got no tinges of untruth from him at that and had to accept his escort. The settling of birds in the trees for the night told her that dusk was well advanced. She could hear the waking calls of owls and knew time was thin. They walked in silence on the path through the woods. As they neared the Rath, Anne found she could see bits of things, getting brighter the closer they came. The path wound past the old fairy fort at a little distance, and Skye frowned when Anne turned aside from the main route onto the one that led directly to the mound entrance. "I thought you said Capine knew the way home. That way's the knoll." "I know," she said reluctantly. When she kept going, Skye reached out and took her arm, pulled her to a halt. "What are you up to, lass?" She turned on him, embarrassed, but knew from the look in his steely eyes that she wasn't going any further until she told him. "I've a meeting, and you're making me late." He scowled. "Has this to do with that ring you talked to Friday last?" He was worried she might be being compelled to go to the Northerner's realm or meet one of her people. "No," she protested, jerking her arm out of his grasp. "It has to do with summat you're not allowed to know." "Well, you're not taking a step more until I do, so make up your mind," he growled. She glared up at him. The full impact of her gaze was lost in the swelling dark. "Only if you swear to secrecy. You can't tell a male soul in the rest." "What you mean?" "Swear it," she snapped. "Fine. I'll not tell a male soul. Now where are we going?" She straightened, startled. "You're not coming with?" "I'll tell you where I'm going, but you're not coming." "Then neither are you," he said, folding his arms across his chest and scowling down at her. The growing light from the mound made him more visible to her than she was to him. She could tell by the set of his jaw that there was no moving him. "I'm going to meet the prince, and I need to get there afore moonrise." His stance loosened a bit. "Why do you not say so? There's no trouble to escort you to the castle." "I'm not going to the castle," she said curtly as she turned and began walking towards the door in the glowing hill. This time he let her, following along behind. "I'm to meet him at his pavilion afore he leaves on his hunt." "Then you need me. If he's not in his father's lands, there's no telling what might try to stop you." Anne said nothing, stood before the small hill, waiting for the door to appear. When the last light of the sun faded from sight, it shimmered into view and came open under her hand. She stepped through into the fairy world and paused to take a deep breath, of the sweet, vivid air. She looked around, saw everything, the grass, the trees, the brightening trod. Tonight it was a Seelie road. Skye noticed the hedge maze that had been here when he left was gone, and the landscape was slightly different. A quarter league up the trod was the tree-lined curve in the road from whence he had sent on alone, and turned to fight the first of the wild hounds. Sitting just before this curve was a large tent, glowing softly gold in the night. It was towards this tent that On headed and set a brisk pace. Skye took uncomfortable note that the tent stood alone, with only a single guard at the flap. If the prince were going on a hunt, where were his horses? Where were his huntsmen? The guard started to challenge them, then he recognized Skye. He snapped back to attention. "Commander Skye, sir, I was not told you were accompanying the governess. If you'll give me a moment, sir." He ducked into the tent and returned a half moment later, holding it open for both of them. Stepping inside, they were welcomed by familiar and comforting smells. Skye could smell metal and leather and armor oil, the scents of battle preparation. On smelled books and fairy fabrics and lily water. Lion was seated beside a table, sharpening a dagger. Eagle stood behind him in a dark hunting gown, putting a book away. Lion stood when they entered, crossed to On to take her hand as she sank into a deep curtsy. The prince pulled her to her feet, kissing her hand. Eagle smiled and drifted nearer. His voice was as warm and deep as his father's, with a faint rumble that made her think of lions. "No. Rise, teacher. You of all people have earned the right to stand before us." She blushed as she rose, looking into his piercing blue eyes. He had grown into a strikingly handsome young elf. He was taller and broader of limb than Johnny, she noted, and far more beautiful, if that was even possible. "Lion," she said, being careful not to thank him, and to use the name she knew he would prefer. Eagle fluttered closer. Her hair was just as long as ever, drawn up in her impossible braids and gleaming like liquid gold. If her brother had grown into a handsome man, she was a breathtaking young woman. Behind her, she noted that even Skye was affected by her, going stiffly formal. Her dark blue eyes were piercing as she took On's hand from her brother. "Salutations, teacher. You have been missed. You look well, princess. I confess I am a little shocked by the changes, but they are good." "And overdue," Lion said dismissively. He turned to Skye. "You were unexpected, Commander. I hope everything goes well." His eyes communicated more than his words, and Skye felt the weight of the responsibility handed to him. "Aye, your highness, as far as she's letting me," he added sheepishly. Lion actually laughed at that. "Never was one to allow security constraints to interfere with life." He clapped Skye on the shoulder. "Good luck with that." He turned back to his seat at the table, leaving Skye glowing with pride. He gestured On towards the only other chair in the room. "Please, teacher, sit. Tell me what you wish." "Well," she began, then remembered what was in the bag as she set it down. "Oh, I have brought—" She carefully leaned Capine against the back of the chair as she began to fish the books out of the bag. She did not notice Eagle eyeing the shillelagh warily, but Skye did, though he said nothing as he took up his place behind On. The princess looked at her brother briefly before crossing to On to accept the 3 volumes held out to her. "These were the best I could find that might suit your purposes. I just hope you remember your English. I think I taught you that one very early on. The 3rd one is a current dictionary of the English language, just in case. There are new words that even I do not know yet, especially scientific ones. I'm not sure how much of it will work here, but—" She gave a gesture of "oh well" with her hands and sat down. "I remember a good bit of it, and I will remember more as I read," Eagle said as she looked over the volumes. "These should be acceptable. We will discover with suitable experimentation what will and will not work. Mr. Sawgrass," she said the name with distaste, as if he were beneath her, "is fielding a lot of these type of elementals. While they do not work in our realm as they work in his, they still function. This could make a difference." With that, she drifted to the back of the tent to another table and sat down, began reading immediately. She set the dictionary open beside her for quick reference. Skye did not like the mention of Sawgrass's encroachment on the king's territories. He remembered dealing with minions of that particular gentry, full of muck and mire. He was a minor factor in the daily struggles of the Fae, and not even the Northerner bothered to ally with him. On turned back to Lion and tried to smile, feeling very nervous now. Lion repeated himself. Tell me what it is you wish. She clasped her hands in her lap, keenly aware of Sky behind her, and tried to proceed without fidgeting. There is a ritual coming up, Yule, and the O'Keefes celebrate it with a winter masque, where the Holly King and the Oak King both have to find the Queen among the masked women to win an advantage in the coming battle for supremacy of the seasons. My friend, the Queen, wishes to play a prank on the Holly King. She saw him smile and the light go on behind his eyes, and she knew she was on the right track. The prince still loved a good prank. She has asked a local witch for charms which will obscure the crown and make all the women appear equally magical. She glared over her shoulder at Sky, whose eyes were wide with surprise and amusement. Which she can easily do, but making another appear to be wearing a hidden crown is beyond her skill. Lion leaned forward, elbows on his knees and a grin on his fair lips. And you need something to make you appear to be the queen in disguise. An took a breath of relief. Hi, my prince, you have the way of it. So what is it you wish to be? For there is more to this request, or you would simply have asked in your letter. Her relief dried up instantly. She looked down at her fingers. He was always more astute than she would have liked, even as a child, which he most certainly wasn't any more. I wish... An got a hold of herself, inwardly chiding herself for behaving like a shy little girl asking for a kiss. She sat up straighter and spoke less softly. I want the fairy tale. At this, Eagle looked up, but said nothing. For one night, I want to be unforgettable. To be Cinderella and have a chance to win my prince. His eyebrow went up at that, and she feared he might think she meant him, but his words soothed that even as they startled her. So which have you set your cap for? The griffin or the stag? What? She gasped. Neither. I'm not that much the fool. She blushed. His voice was gentle as he coaxed it from her. Who, my teacher? She all but whispered. Just once I want to be beautiful, to be the kind of woman who might catch the eye of a bard, to be worthy of his attention. Sky caught the look in Eagle's eye as she turned her head to her brother, her finger marking her place in the book. Lion did not look back at her, merely smiled sadly and shook his head slightly. Ah, my lady of the mist, for one so wise you are so naive. She looked up at him in panic, fearing he would say no. Fear not, teacher. You shall have your wish. Her hand went to her necklace, and he shook his head. Nay, this is my gift to you. Let us say it is for the prank. Yes, let's, Eagle said dryly, still staring at her brother. He ignored her. Meet me here again, just before dawn the day of Yule, the day of the mask. Come dusk, you will be ready. Now, he said, standing and tucking his dagger into his hard riding boots. Now the moon is rising, and we must be off. An rose, taking Capine in hand and curtsying once more to the royal pair, as Eagle almost lazily rose from her chair and set her book on the table. I wish you good of your quarry. Eagle smiled as she pulled on a pair of leather gloves that made her delicate hands look more like eagle's claws. The expression was predatory. And them the worst of us. Aye. The princess stopped before she pulled on the second glove, remembering something. She went to a box and pulled out a small bundle of white cobweb silk thread. It glittered on the skein as if even the dewdrops had been caught up in it. She placed it into An's hands. For your new little princess. Make her a pair of gloves as fine as the ones you made me. An started to curtsy again, stopped, and pressed a kiss to her cheek instead, much as she used to do when the woman had been young. She was taller than Sky now, and more stately. She could have imagined the blush she felt in Eagle's cheek. I will strive to make my work worthy of my materials. Eagle smiled. Just remember a little colt's foot oil on your fingers. It helps keep it from being sticky and tangling. I'll remember. With that, the guard was opening the flap, and she and Sky stepped out into the night in the midst of an active hunting camp. 2 fine and high-spirited horses stood by, held by a groomsman, and dressed in such a way as there was no confusing to whom they belonged. The stallion was a tawny gold, with a rippling mane and a lion skin for a saddle blanket. The mare, a high-stepping bay with a white crest that stood up, was adorned with feathers. Before the flap fell behind them, An heard Eagle's voice raised to her brother. Is it wise to encourage her? Is she strong enough to go where that road leads? She has to be, or... and the conversation was cut off as the silk fell, leaving An wondering the wisdom of her heart. They stepped aside, and An let Sky guide her back and out of the way, protecting her from the last-minute bustle as the huntsman mounted up and the sleek, white, massive Kushi gathered near, eager for the blood of whatever they were hunting. Sky set his hand on her shoulder to still the expected fear at seeing the hounds, but she was calm. One passed them by and sniffed them, and An surprised Sky by holding out her hand and letting the beast sniff before she ran it through the fur below his ear. The hound gave her a chuff as he was called away, trotting up to the golden horse as his master strode from the tent and mounted up, the princess right behind him, mounting her own restless steed. The pair of them stayed to watch the fairy host ride out. It was an impressive sight, one An had never seen, not this close. The children had never been old enough, and they had watched from the battlements as the king had ridden out without them. It was much more impressive from down among them. The host rode towards the gate, but veered off on a different path not far from it. An held her position until they were out of sight. Only then did she allow Sky to take her back down the dimming trod towards the gate, and the rest beyond it. They were out of the mound and back on the path to their respective homes before she spoke again. It was almost a mumble. "He's right. More the fool's me." Sky bristled. "He said you were naive. 'Tis not to say you're a fool." "Comes to the same end." She strode on ahead, walking a little faster, and refused to say another word. He followed a few paces back, close enough to catch her if she were to stumble, but far enough to give her the illusion of privacy. He stopped between the buildings, at the edge of her wall, and watched her go to her little gate. She paused just inside it. "What you heard tonight? No male ears, understood?" He folded his arms over his chest and gave her a stubborn look. "Woman, I have no idea what you're talking about." She nodded her head once. "Fine." Sky did not move from where he stood until the door closed behind her. Inside, An found a fire waiting merrily for her and set her bag on the bench. Putting Capine in her corner, she sat to remove her boots. She reached into her bag and pulled out the white thread she had bought and the packet of hooks, went to the table beside her chair and set them on top of it. She ran her hand over the table's polished surface, telling the house in the way it told her things, that these were all for the use of her little friend, if it was wanted. She heard the sound of the kettle whistle on the stove and looked over, saw the cup on the counter with the tea bag hanging from it. She gave a tired smile. "Not tonight. I really need to get some sleep. You're welcome to it, an you like. And Martha put some of her caramel apple crumble in the pantry. Help yourself to a bit of that too. She'll be offended if none of the crumble's missing. If she's made any sweetbreads for breakfast, I think one of those and a cup will be all I'll be wanting in the morning. She sighed, heading to her room. "I'm just not in the mood, really." She felt the house was not happy that she was not happy, as the living room fire died back and the one in the bedroom sprang up. An changed into the freshly laundered gown waiting on the bed and sat at the dressing table to brush out and braid up her hair. She felt exhausted, emotionally and physically. Now that the moon was out and filling her room with its silvery glow, she felt the day weighing her down like a heavy quilt. She turned to the bed and found a dainty, oddly shaped mug steaming fragrantly on her nightstand. She sniffed the dark liquid and smelled chamomile and vanilla and a hint of something more potent. She sat on the bed and sighed. Normally she eschewed alcohol, but in this case, perhaps it would help her to sleep better. She drank the hot toddy and found she could not complain about the flavor. Before she had finished it, there was a delightful heaviness to her limbs that told her she was more than ready for sleep. Feeling warm, she threw open the sash to let in the cool night breezes, tucked herself under her light covers, and slept. An woke to the sun shining in her eyes and rolled over to bury her face in the pillow. She felt as if she had just lain down. After a moment of lying there, she began to hear the kettle whistling as loudly as if it were in the room with her. Finally, she threw off the covers and rose. She checked the open-faced watch on her dressing table and groaned. It was nearly 8. The car was supposed to come for her in half an hour. She hurriedly dressed, rushing into the kitchen to see if she had time for a cup of strong tea. She did not bother to pack, knowing that once she got back to her little garret, she would be activating the door to hear. There was a single cup of tea waiting on the counter, which she was grateful for, but said nothing. She did not want to insult the brownie. She had worried that the gift of the thread and needles might have been taken the wrong way and driven her off, but the waiting tea set her at ease over that. She swallowed down the tea and rushed to the front door, pulling on her freshly brushed and cleaned boots and lacing them up. She heard the car pull up in front of her gate and grabbed the black bag where it sat beside her on the bench, threw on her shawl and held out her hand. Gapeen jumped into it, and she trotted down the path to the open gate, only slowing when she crossed that threshold and could no longer see what was in front of her. She proceeded at a more sedate pace, holding out her hand for the driver to take and help her into the car. Once inside, she felt the stimulation of the tea and running late start to fade. She reached into the bag to pull out the threads, feeling her way through them, to find the one she had been working on, and felt something hard and small in a side pocket she had not known was there. Putting her hand in it, she found her hooks neatly organized and a small bottle of sweet coltsfoot oil, and smiled. She arrived at the house as Mrs. Tallow was leaving for work. Sharon paused long enough to welcome her back and let her into the house. "I hope you had as wonderful a time as we did," she beamed. "Elizabeth's already off to school, but she'll probably talk your ear off when she gets home." "I'm sure. I'm glad you enjoyed it. You deserved the time off." She went into the house as Sharon left, locking the door behind her, and going straight into the kitchen to find something for the breakfast she'd missed. She made herself another cup of tea without much difficulty, until she reached to the back of the counter where the canisters of sugar and flour were kept. The tender underside of her wrist brushed against the ceramic pot that was not normally there, and was extremely hot. She pulled back as she felt the burn begin. She gasped as it didn't stop, but instead continued to swell as the burning filled her until it was the sum of her existence. When she reached the tempering of the ocean, she fell back, cracking her head on the counter behind her and collapsing to the floor in a puddle, gasping for air and bleeding from a cut on her scalp. The flashback was as vivid as the first vision and left her weak and sobbing in a heap. She tried to rise, reaching up the cupboard looking for some support and failing. Her head swam when she sat up. She had to get off the floor, had to remember where there was a phone in the house. She remembered Sharon spending time on the phone in the kitchen, remembered running into a long cord between Sharon and the wall by the fridge. She dragged herself closer to the humming cold she could feel. She scraped the burn on the linoleum and set off another repeat of the whole vision. As soon as she could breathe again, still suffering through little corpse after little corpse, she reached up, flailing for the long, curling cord she knew was there somewhere. Her fingers caught the rubbery spring coil and pulled, begging the phone to drop to her. The old Bakelite handset landed with a crack next to her other fingers, missing them by millimeters. Ann grabbed it and pulled it close, fumbling for the buttons, to remember the number she had been told to use. After a few seconds that seemed like minutes, Roulette's voice came sleepily through her ear.
"Hello?"
She yawned. It was all Ann could do to choke out, "Roulette, help me. Make it stop. Please. Don't tell Sky." She felt something happening and pushed the phone away from her just in time, as a burst of lightning emerged from the handset and solidified into Roulette. She stood there, wearing only a long t-shirt and panties and looking wild with her hair writhing as if alive. She looked around for the trouble, saw the blood, and Ann curled in on herself and dropped beside her. "Baby, what happened?" she asked, even as she was checking to see how bad Ann was hurt. "I burnt myself. I had the vision again. I hit my head, and I get dizzy when I sit up. I'm hurt, and I didn't know what else to do. I can't clean up what I can't see." Roulette looked around the kitchen, took everything in. "Okay, looks like you burned yourself on the crock pot." She checked her over. "The burn's not bad, and neither is your head. I can fix both. Just hold still." Ann felt like 1,000 ants were creeping over her body, nibbling without real pain, just tingling all over. It sank into her burned arm and the back of her head, and the headache and dizziness began to subside. She breathed a sigh of relief as the pressure eased off. "All this was caused by the vision?" Roulette asked, helping Ann to her feet. "Well, the burn caused all the rest. The first when I touched the pot, the second when I scraped the burn on the floor. I hit my head when I started drowning." Roulette guided her around the smeared puddles of blood, checked to make sure she wasn't leaving bloody footprints. "All right, first things first. Let's get you cleaned up. I'll get your clothes to the laundress before the blood dries." "Blood is a hard thing," she protested. Roulette laughed. "The laundress is a bagnée. She's an expert at blood. Working with the family, she has a lot of experience. Once I have you in the shower, I'll come back down and clean the kitchen up, then come up to do the bathroom, okay? Ay, she sighed, hating that she had to ask, but grateful there was someone she could. It did not take long. Anne showered, getting the blood out of her hair and wrapping up in towels. Roulette found her room and brought her a change of clothes, let her dress while she got all traces of blood from the shower walls where it had splattered with the water. Anne finally settled on the bed in her garret and breathed deeply. While Roulette pulled up the chair and straddled it, Anne reached over to the nightstand and pulled out the cell phone, slipping it into a pocket in her skirt. I think I'll be keeping this on me at all times from now on. Probably a good idea, Roulette commented. She watched Anne twist her hair up again, never minding that it was wet. This the first time this has happened? That you've seen that vision since you touched the ring? Anne nodded. As far as I know. She shook her head suddenly. No, I had it once the morning after, when I was in the bath, but I don't remember aught else. Though I haven't been sleeping as well as I should. I might be able to fix that. There are things you can take. Laudanum. Anne nodded. Roulette chuckled. Can't really get that these days. But they have these little pills that will help you sleep. I can run to the drugstore and get you some if you like. I need to do something, she sighed. Roulette vanished in a flash, and Anne got up, remembering she needed to open the door to the cottage. She crossed to the closet door and stroked the wood, placing a small, inconsequential glamour on it as she hummed a particular melody. She felt the magic flare beneath her hand and turned the knob. It opened into the living room of her cottage, and she sighed, taking a deep breath. She hadn't realized until that moment how stale the air in the garret was, filled with the musty smell of old wood and wallpaper, or how alive was her new home. Roulette was back 5 minutes later. She handed Anne a small bottle, showed her how to open it. I've already pulled the damned cotton out of it, so it'll be easy for you tonight. Just put it in your nightstand and take one before bed. Should put you right out. I hate resorting to this, she began. What if something happens while I'm out? Hon, you have to sleep sometime. Got what, at least 4 hours until Elizabeth gets home? Why don't you take half of one now and get some rest before she does? Sleep during the day so you can watch at night. There's a thought to that. Here, she said, and flashed for a moment. Then she was back, pressed a glass of water into Anne's hand. Go ahead. I'm going to head back to the apartment over Quartz and catch some shut-eye myself. She guided Anne back towards her small bed. Now, don't hesitate to call me if you need anything. Anne nodded, surrendering. She sat down, slipping out of her boots and swallowing half of one of the tiny pills. She laid down on the coverlet fully clothed, pulling the side of it over her, and tried to sleep as Roulette zipped out of the house as quickly as she had arrived. Only a trace of ozone in the air proclaimed that she had even been there. Anne lay there, trying to feel the drift of oncoming sleep, and found herself thinking of her little house, and how dead this room suddenly felt. Anne was once more trapped in the cycle, repeating it over and over without end, until suddenly there was a break in it. A hot flash in the middle of her forehead in the midst of the eternal cold sea, and she opened her eyes to a hand in front of her face, and a small finger pressed to her brow. She gasped, blinking, and the hand withdrew, and she found herself looking into Elizabeth's concerned blue eyes, which were slightly more violet at the moment. The girl said nothing, just moved her hand and sat back, watching her warily with that look that mothers get when they're determining just how sick their child really is. Anne met that gaze unflinching as she ran her own assessment. Finally, Anne whispered, That is not going to work. What isn't? The child's voice was flat. These, she said, pulling the bottle out of the drawer and handing them to Elizabeth. Get rid of them, please. Elizabeth turned them over in her hand. Why'd you take these? In the middle of the day? Anne sighed, started to explain, then stopped and looked at her. What did you do to me? Elizabeth shrugged, slipping the pills in the pocket of her windbreaker, intending to put them in her mother's medicine cabinet later. I came home and couldn't find you, but the house was giving me a headache. I wanted to ask you about it, but you weren't downstairs, so I came up here to see. You were sweating and thrashing, but like you were held down. You weren't breathing. I tried to wake you up, and you wouldn't, so I poked your third eye. Anne frowned. I have only 2, she said. Elizabeth smiled. No, you have 3. Everyone does. It's a chakra point, and an important one. It's a metaphysical thing. I looked it up once, trying to figure out what was different about me. Anne rubbed her forehead. Well, I'm glad you did, whatever it was. What was wrong with you? Your body read differently. Like it wasn't you, but was, or like someone else was wrapped up inside you. Anne started to evade the question, then realized there was a lesson here. She gestured for Elizabeth to shift so she could sit up. I did something for a friend without thinking this weekend. I used some of those magics that I have to learn about a magical thing that turned out to be very dangerous. This is the backlash. I will have to find a way to cope until it lessens. I was hoping to sleep during the day so I might remain vigilant tonight, but another thought occurred to her. There was no way she could bring herself to sleep in this room again, and if something happened in the house, there was a clear route for Elizabeth to escape out of their reach. She slipped her arm around the girl's shoulder and pulled her close. Do you remember those books we read that first fortnight of school? The ones by C.S. Lewis? Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? She grinned. Yeah, I love those. The last battle was kind of sad, though. Well, further up and further in, I tell you. But you have to promise me you'll not use this frivolously. You will not wander beyond, because this is a real place with real dangers, very different from here. If I tell you a place is forbidden you, it is because, for you especially, there are terrible things that can happen to you there. It is past time I took you to a friend of mine. Who? Her eyes lit up. You've met him. His name is Sean. Now, do you have homework? Elizabeth tipped her head. Yes, but it's really easy and not due until Wednesday. I can do it tomorrow without any trouble. Also, Mom's not going to be home till Dad is, after 8. Because she took Friday off, she has a ton of extra stuff to do. She left a note for me to microwave us something. Well, that will not do at all, Anne said, standing. She straightened her vest and held out her hand for Capine. Now, from now on, if you need me in the night, this is where you will find me. You must promise me never to say thank you for anything done for you where we are going. I happen to like my little friend and do not want them to leave, nor must you try to catch sight of him or her. Elizabeth's eyes glittered as she looked up at her governess. All right. Anne led her to the closet door, running her fingers lightly down the wood before her, and quietly hummed the refrain to Red as the Rose. The door clicked, and Anne gestured for the girl to open it. She paused a moment to look at Anne with a suspicious excitement, then pulled open the door and gasped with delight at the little house which loomed beyond the portal. Anne took her hand and led her through, pausing just past the threshold to introduce her. House, this is my ward, Elizabeth Tallow. She is to be allowed through the door if she needs me, and if she knocks, please let me hear it no matter the hour. She put out her hand to the wall to feel the response and smiled. It says you're welcome here, but I am going to ask you to be on your best behaviour, and once you have activated the door and heard the click, that you knock first. You will know whether or not it is all right to enter. She nodded, swallowing as she tried to take it all in, to read the house as she sometimes read people. It overwhelmed her. You live here? I do now. Danny built it for me. I can see everything in it. I will be sleeping just through that door, she said, pointing to her bedchamber, from now on. I can see why you'd rather. 'Tis no slight to your mother's delightful accommodations. Had this place not existed, I would be more than content there. Now, you and I have a visit to pay. She led her through the living room to the front door, which opened for them and out into the garden. Anne stopped on the front step, thinking about where they should go from here. Then she saw Liberty coming around the side of her house with an armful of something and smiled. "Liberty!" she called. The woman paused, looked over, and grinned. "Hello, Anne, love. Who's your friend?" "Liberty, this is Elizabeth Tallow. Elizabeth, this is Miss O'Keefe, a close friend of mine." Liberty's eyebrow went up as the name clicked. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Tallow." "Anne, what can I do for you?" she asked in that pointed tone that said things her words didn't. "I need to take her to see Sean and, well, I thought letting my house make a decent supper was better than somewhat from that infernal microwave. Her mother's working late tonight." "It happens enough I know what to do," Elizabeth chirruped. "More now that she knows Anne will take care of things." Anne gave her a glare. "Well, not more, but Mom worries less when it does." Anne cleared her throat, and finally the child got it. She politely straightened up and said, "Afternoon, Miss O'Keefe." Liberty smiled and continued to the front of the house. "Let me take care of these and I'll be right there. I'll see where Sean's at." "Thank you, love," Anne sighed. She turned back to the house and set her hand on the lintel, silently telling it that Elizabeth would be staying for dinner. Moments later, Liberty had come over, phone to her ear, and clicked off as she came through the gate. Liberty paused to shake Elizabeth's hand, meeting her more formally. She turned to Anne. "All right, Sky said we could use the mead hall. He's got no classes today. Sean's meeting us around here very shortly. When do you have to have her back?" 8, I think. I figured we'd dine here about 7 before I take her home. She looked down at the girl. "If I am ever not at home and something's happened, that is where Liberty lives, and that," she pointed to the other side of the garden wall, "large building there is where you'll find Sky. He's an enormous Scotsman, but he'll protect you. Across the way in the gypsy wagon is Solitaire and Roulette, 2 other friends of mine, one of whom you met once. If no one is home, tell the house to have Ian told. Then stay put here and someone will be around." Okay, this is all a little strange. "Oh, it's about to get weirder," came Sean's warm tenor as he appeared at the door to the mead hall. He waved the group over. Anne took Elizabeth's hand and brought her around to where Sean waited. "This is Sean O'Keefe. He will be your McGonagall," Anne added with a smile. The girl's eyes lit up. "Really?" She looked back at him, suddenly recognizing him. "You're one of the ones who got rid of the stick woman. You were in the yard last week, too." "Aye, I was," he said as she shook his hand. "Are you willing to trust me? To let me test you and teach you the things Miss Anne here cannot?" Elizabeth actually blushed. "Yes, sir." "Good. We can get started then. Miss O'Keefe, will you be watching or will you be back when we're done?" "Is Sky home?" "Aye." She stepped forward. "Then I'll be at my own lessons." He nodded with approval. "Very well, then." Elizabeth was wide-eyed when she was introduced to Sky. She had walked in, looking around, and turned right into him. She found herself staring at a broad buckle and a thick leather belt above a dark plaid. She looked up, found her neck craned as far as it would go, and just let it hang there, open-mouthed. Sky arched an eyebrow as he looked down at her. The girl's mouth barely twitched as she gaped. "Hi," he chuckled, the sound occurring deep in his chest and coming out a rumble. "You must be Elizabeth." He held his hand down to her. "I'm Sky." When her hand went into his, she spent more time comparing their sizes than actually shaking it. Sky let her, amused by the magic child. He gave on a grin over her head. Finally, he stepped back and gestured to the room. Elizabeth left off gawking at the tall Scot and proceeded to ooh and ah as the mead hall arranged itself to suit their needs. From her half of the large hall, she could see on at fighting practice, but not hear it, so the sounds would not disturb her concentration as Sean tried to figure out what kinds of things she was capable of learning. Sky, meanwhile, put on through her paces and began to notice that her reaction times were down. He frowned. He could see her skill and that she was not in top form. He was about to ask her about it when she stepped back and called a halt. The ringing of his weapon against Scapine, the vibrations going up her arm, were starting to have a familiar ring to them, and she suddenly feared another attack and backed off. "I think this is a bad idea." "You need to learn. You're slower than—" She held up her hand, cutting him off. "I know," she snapped. "But that's not why. It's starting to— We should hold off on that kind of pounding for a while. It's starting to sound like a hammer on an anvil," she growled pointedly as he began to puff up to argue the point. That deflated him, though it took a second for it to filter through. "Perhaps right now we should concentrate on defense that doesn't require you to be armed like a knight and more like a thug." He tossed aside the practice sword immediately. "Aye. Well, let's start with a common mugget." He then proceeded to show her the kinds of ways she could be attacked and various means to escape them. 2 hours later, Anne was sore but feeling tired, which she counted a good thing. Elizabeth was wrapping up at about the same time, and the two of them said their goodbyes and returned to the cottage. Elizabeth was delighted to find a table for 2 set up in front of the fireplace, with all kinds of good things she had never eaten, but that smelled delicious. As Anne took her seat opposite the child, she gave her an indulgent smile. "Now, no sneaking in here for supper just because you do not desire your mother's spinach loaf." There came a sigh at that, which told Anne that had been exactly the child's plan. She laughed, and they ate while she listened to the girl going on about the things she had learned.